The wind was a thief. It stole the moisture from the soil, leaving behind a cracked, skeletal map of what had once been fertile ground. It stole the warmth from Alara's bones. Seeping through the chinks in the cabin walls, her father had built with hands that had long since turned to dust. Most of all, it stole the sound of the world, replacing it with a relentless, mournful howl that echoed the hollowness in her own chest. The grit of it was everywhere. A fine red powder on the windowsill, a bitter taste in her meager stew, a constant irritation in her eyes. This land did not nurture. It scoured. She stood at the rickety porch rail, one hand gripping the splintered wood until her knuckles were white stones. Before her, the plains stretched into an infinity of brown and desiccated gold under a bruised sky. Her father's words, spoken in a fevered whisper on his deathbed, were as persistent as the wind. No one will have you, Alara. Not with that mark. A good man wants a whole wife, not a damaged thing. He hadn't been cruel, only pragmatic. His voice laced with a sorrow that was a heavier burden than any anger. The mark he spoke of was a spidery web of scarred skin that pulled at the corner of her left eye, a permanent reminder of the fire that had taken her mother and branded her an outcast. In the town, a day's ride east, the women whispered behind their hands, and the men looked away, their pity as sharp as contempt. She was a pariah on a failing patch of earth, tethered to it by a promise to a dying man and the simple, terrifying fact that there was nowhere else to go. Her last goat, Pearl, bleated weakly from the lean-to, a sound of such profound misery it snagged at Alara's frayed nerves. The pump handle on the well had snapped 2 days ago, the metal groaning its final complaint before falling silent. She had been hauling brackish water from the creek half a mile away, a back-breaking task that yielded barely enough for herself, let alone the animal. Despair was no longer a visitor. It had taken up permanent residence in her heart. It sat with her during the silent, lonely meals and lay beside her in the cold bed at night. Hope had withered like the corn stalks in the field. As the sun began its slow bleed toward the horizon, the wind shifted. It grew teeth. The sky in the west turned a violent, churning ochre, the color of an old bruise. A dust storm, not a common squall, but one of the great walls of earth that could strip paint from a wagon and bury a fence line in an hour. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her resignation. She hurried, her breath catching in her throat, to secure the shutters. The one on the main window was warped, its leather hinge torn. As she wrestled with it, a splinter drove deep into her palm. She cried out, a small, unheard sound swallowed by the rising gale. She sank back against the cabin wall, defeated. The storm would take what it wanted. It always did. It was through the thickening curtain of dust, a world dissolving into a formless, roaring chaos, that she saw him. A shape, dark and steady, moving through the maelstrom. At first, she thought it was an apparition, a phantom conjured by the wind and her own solitude. But it grew more solid, resolving into a man on a tall, dark horse. He rode not against the storm but with a kind of grim accommodation to it. His body angled into the wind, his hat pulled low. He stopped just beyond her broken fence line, a silhouette of quiet permanence in the swirling apocalypse. He did not call out. He did not wave. He simply dismounted, the movement economical and sure, and tied his horse to the sturdy porch post. He was a stranger, yet his presence felt less like an intrusion and more like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to utter. He walked directly to the flapping shutter, his face obscured by dust and shadow. Without a word, he pulled a length of twine from his saddlebag and, with a few deft knots, secured it tightly against the window frame. Then he turned his attention to the lean-to, its roof rattling as if it would tear away. He moved with a purpose that felt ancient and absolute, a force of order against the encroaching chaos. Alara remained pressed against the wall, the splinter in her hand forgotten. She had been warned her whole life that no one would come for her. No one had asked. He had simply appeared. He did not leave when the storm passed. The dawn broke over a world remade in dust, the air thick and tasting of raw earth. Alara woke to the rhythmic, metallic clang of a hammer striking an anvil. Peering through the newly secured window, she saw him at her small, disused forge, heating the broken pump handle in the coals he had somehow coaxed to life. He worked with a silent, focused intensity, his shoulders broad beneath a worn chambray shirt. He was a man made of straight lines and solid angles, his movements spare and necessary. There was nothing wasted in him. She spent the day watching him from a distance, a knot of suspicion and a fragile seedling of gratitude tangled within her. Who was he? What did he want? Men did not simply appear and offer labor for no reason. Not in her world. By midday, the clang of the hammer had been replaced by the rhythmic squeak and splash of the repaired pump. Clean water now flowed into the trough. He then turned his attention to Pearl, checking the animal's cloudy eyes and labored breathing. He disappeared toward the creek and returned with a clutch of green herbs she didn't recognize. He crushed them, mixed them with water, and gently forced the paste into the goat's mouth. They did not speak. The silence between them was vast, filled only by the sounds of his work and the ever-present sigh of the wind. When the sun was high, she ladled a bowl of her thin rabbit stew, placed it on the porch rail with a piece of cornbread, and retreated back inside, bolting the door. It felt like an offering to a wild thing she did not wish to frighten or anger. She watched through the window as he stopped his work, approached the porch and took the bowl. He ate standing, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if reading a language written there that she had never learned. When he was finished, he rinsed the bowl with fresh water from the pump and set it carefully back on the rail. The next morning, 2 skinned rabbits were lying on the porch in the bowl's place. The silent transaction was complete. A debt paid or a new one incurred. She wasn't sure which. He spent that day mending the fence that bordered the western edge of her property, replacing the rotten posts, his movements as patient and methodical as the turning of the seasons. He never approached the house. He never spoke to her. And most unervingly, he never once looked directly at her face. His gaze would pass over her, but it never lingered on the scar, the flawed geography of her cheek that had defined her entire existence. He looked at the leaking roof, the broken fence, the sick animal, at the things that were broken and needed fixing. He seemed not to see the brokenness in her at all. This unsettling lack of notice was more intimate than any stare she had ever endured. The townsfolk's pity and revulsion were a mirror, constantly forcing her to see herself through their eyes. This man, this silent stranger, gave her nothing to reflect off. In his presence, free from the weight of judgment, she felt a strange, terrifying lightness. She began to observe him not as a threat, but as a feature of the landscape, like a weathered mesa or a tenacious juniper tree. She noted the way he paused at sunset, a moment of stillness before retreating to the barn where he had made his bed in the hayloft. She saw the weariness in his shoulders at the end of the day, a mirror of the ache in her own. They were 2 solitary creatures orbiting a dying homestead, their paths bound by unspoken necessity. Trust was too strong a word for what was growing between them. It was more like an acclamation, the way a lone tree learns to bend with the wind so as not to break. One evening, she left a lit lantern by the barn door. The next morning, a small pile of freshly chopped firewood was stacked neatly on her porch. The man's name was Croft, and he rode a fat, prosperous-looking bay. He owned the sprawling ranch to the south, and his greed was as vast and arid as the land itself. He arrived one blistering afternoon, flanked by 2 hired men whose faces were hard and empty. Alara was tending to Pearl, now strong enough to stand and nibble at her hand, thanks to the stranger's remedies. When they rode into her yard, their horses kicking up arrogant clouds of dust. "Well now, Alara," Croft began, not bothering to dismount. His voice was slick with false geniality. "Still holding on to this place. Admirable. Or foolish." His eyes, small and porcine, flickered over the repaired pump, the mended fence. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features. "Looks like you've had some help. Didn't think there was a man in this territory desperate enough." His words were a physical blow, striking the old, tender wound of her inadequacy. She felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the shame that was her constant companion. She straightened her spine, her hand resting on Pearl's back for support. "This is my land, Mr. Croft. For now," he sneered, his smile widening. He gestured expansively at the arid landscape. "But land like this needs a firm hand. A man's hand. Your father knew that. He knew you weren't suited. Is a kindness really what I'm offering? A fair price. Enough for you to go somewhere else. Somewhere a woman with your disadvantages might find an easier life." He let the word hang in the air, a deliberate cruelty. Disadvantages. The scar on her face tingled, as if his gaze were a physical touch. The two men with him smirked. This was his strategy. Not just to take her land, but to dismantle her spirit first, to reinforce the town's verdict until she believed it herself and simply surrendered. Fear, that old, cold friend, began to whisper in her ear. "He's right. You can't do this alone." Her resolve began to crumble. Her voice, when she tried to speak again, was a dry rustle of leaves. It was then that he appeared. The stranger. He emerged from the barn, holding a heavy axe he'd been using to split logs, its head gleaming dully in the sun. He didn't run. He walked, his pace unhurried, deliberate. He stopped beside her, a few feet away, a silent, imposing presence. He didn't look at Croft. He didn't look at the hired men. He looked at the axe in his hands, turning it over slowly, as if testing its balance. The message was unmistakable. It wasn't a direct threat, but a quiet statement of capability, of a line being drawn in the dust. Croft's smile tightened. "And who might this be?" "Your new scarecrow." The stranger said nothing. His silence was more potent than any shouted threat. It created a vacuum in the hot, still air, a space that Alara felt compelled to fill. His presence beside her was a bulwark. It was not his strength she drew from, but his stillness. It quieted the panicked fluttering in her own chest. She looked directly at Croft, and for the first time, she did not feel the pull of her scar. She did not feel like a damaged thing. She felt like the owner of this land, and her voice, when it came, was not a whisper but a clear, steady tone that cut through the tension. "He is here," she said simply, "and this is my land. You are not welcome here, Mr. Croft. Leave." The authority in her own voice surprised her. Surprised Croft, too. He stared at her, then at the silent man with the axe and back again. He saw not a frightened girl and a drifter, but a unified front, an unexpected complication. The easy victory he had imagined was gone. With a frustrated curse, he yanked on his reins. "This isn't over," he spat, before wheeling his horse around. His men followed, casting nervous glances back at the unmoving figure by the barn. As they rode away, their dust cloud seemed less arrogant, more like a hasty retreat. The threat receded, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. The dust settled. The heat of the afternoon sun beat down on the quiet yard. The confrontation had passed, leaving an altered landscape between them. He was still standing there, the axe held loosely in one hand. She was still by the goat pen, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a strange, fierce pride. She had not flinched. She had found her voice, and he had been the sounding board that allowed it to resonate. He finally looked at her, his gaze direct for the first time. It traveled from her eyes to the scar on her cheek and back again. A simple, unprying observation. There was no pity in it.
No curiosity.
There was only acknowledgement. That evening, a shift occurred, as definite as the turning of the earth. She cooked the stew, thicker this time, with potatoes from the root cellar and the last of the salted pork. But instead of leaving it on the porch rail, she set 2 bowls on the small, scrub table inside the cabin. She lit the good lantern, its glow casting a warm, gentle light that softened the harsh lines of the room. She left the cabin door ajar, an invitation that felt as loud as a shout in the vast silence of their shared world. Then she waited, her hands clasped in her lap. After a time, she saw his shadow fall across the doorway. He stood there for a long moment, outlined against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. He looked at the table, at the second bowl, at her. She met his gaze, her expression open, vulnerable, but unafraid. He slowly removed his hat, a gesture of respect she had never witnessed from him, and stepped across the threshold, ducking his head slightly to clear the frame. He sat opposite her at the table, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. The silence that fell was not empty or tense. It was companionable, a shared quiet that spoke of mutual understanding. They ate without speaking, the scrape of spoons against earthenware the only sound. When they were finished, Alara took a breath, the words she had held inside for a lifetime finally rising to the surface. Her voice was soft, but carried the weight of years. "My father told me no man would have me," she said, looking at her hands on the table. "The people in town, they say a woman with a past like mine, a face like mine, is a curse. That I'd be alone forever." He was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. She risked a glance at him. He was looking out the open door at the first stars beginning to prick the darkness. His expression was thoughtful, unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, steady rumble, like stones settling deep in the earth. "They say a lot of things," he said, his gaze finally returning to hers. "Wind blows, dust settles. The land doesn't care what they say." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "A person's worth ain't in what's been taken from them. It's in what they've held on to." And with that, he dismissed a decade of whispers, a lifetime of shame. He did not offer empty platitudes or gentle reassurances. He offered something far more valuable, a truth as solid and unforgiving as the land itself. Her worth was not in her unmarred skin, but in her unbroken spirit. The scar on her face was not a mark of damage, but a testament to survival. In the quiet glow of the lantern, Alara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She was not cursed. She was a survivor. She had held on. Later, as he rose to leave, he paused at the door. "Name's Silas," he said, and then he was gone, retreating to the barn under a sky full of stars. The night was quiet, the wind had died down, and for the first time in a very long time, Alara did not feel alone. She was not just a woman on a patch of dirt. She was part of a partnership, unspoken and forged in silence, ready to face the dawn.